In 1776, Thomas Jefferson co-created and signed the Declaration of Independence, declaring independence from British rule. Penned in the second paragraph of this document, Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. Jefferson's actions argued otherwise due to the fact that he justified slavery but continued to support a system of human bondage. Jefferson himself owned up to 225 slaves and condoned the support of slavery as a natural state because of the intense need for labor in the American colonies. Jefferson was also considered to be one of the first people to articulate a theory of race because he set out American science to figure out what aspects of African people made them inferior to white people. In portions of Jefferson's book, Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson discusses the indigenous people living in America at the time and felt that they were not very different in comparison to the Europeans. Jefferson mentions his attraction towards their appearance as free people and brave warriors protecting the land they own. He felt that the only issue with the indigenous tribes were their culture, as it differed from the European man's. With the help of education and environment, Jefferson discusses how he felt the indigenous people could be assimilated into the, quote, American culture. When Jefferson bought the territory under the Louisiana Purchase, several indigenous tribes occupied land throughout the territory. After the purchase, the U.S. took a Eurocentrism approach and decided that the cheapest and easiest idea, and to prevent a war, would be to, quote, civilize the indigenous people through Christian religion, English education, and commercial agriculture.
An act to provide for the allotment of land in severalty to Indians on the various reservations, commonly known as the Dawes Act, was approved on February 8, 1887. The act broke up communally owned Native American land holdings into individual plots given to individual tribal people. Specifically affected by the Dawes Act were those known as the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles. The Dawes Commission set up offices in Native American territory and was where Native Americans would have to go to apply for tribal enrollment. The Dawes Commission would judge Native American identity, also known as blood quantum, by a panel of white people, along with an occasional family member testimonial. If approved, they would apply again to be placed on a tribal roll and would receive their allotted land. Despite the stated purpose of the act being to protect Native American property rights, the true purpose was the assimilation of the indigenous people. Splitting up tribes as well as family forced indigenous people to be more economically, socially, and especially culturally American. Assimilation of indigenous people was a priority of the government because the indigenous race was seen as inferior, and the white man felt burdened with the duty to oversee their welfare.
The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 was passed by President Roosevelt and was often referred to as the Indian New Deal or the Wheeler-Howard Act. This act was put in place with the intent to reverse the effects of the Dawes Act of 1887. While the Dawes Act's main goal was to assimilate indigenous people into American society through force and without input from tribes, the Indian Reorganization Act ended the allotment of tribal lands and extended the trust period for existing allotments, recognized tribal governments, and encouraged tribes to adopt constitutions, prohibited lands from being taken away from tribes without their consent, and gave tribes the power to manage their assets, which was mostly land at the time. The Indian Reorganization Act improved the political, social, and economic conditions within indigenous peoples.
In November of 1864, members of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes were brutally massacred by the Colorado military. Of the hundreds murdered, more than half of them were women and children. As the search for gold in the Colorado Rockies were bringing in waves of Euro-American miners, pressures of scarce resources were challenging the indigenous tribes occupying the arid plains. As a way to ease the pressure from these tribes, the Fort Laramie Treaty was conducted and agreed upon by the governor of Colorado and both the tribes. In the treaty, the tribes were asked to downsize their land in return for annuity payments to sustain the tribes. As the years passed and the payments provided were not sustaining the tribes, tensions rose. With the Civil War around the corner, the tribes were invited to move closer to military forts, where they were provided provisions and protection. On the morning of November 29th, 600 Colorado soldiers attacked the tribes occupying Sand Creek. Disregarding the plea of friendship and mercy displayed by members of both the tribes, the military brutally slaughtered hundreds. The attack displays ethnic cleansing and the extreme hatred and racism towards the tribes, especially due to the fact that the two tribes displayed white flags in peace, yet the village was still set to fire. Today, the attack is seen as a war crime by U.S. soldiers and condemned by the U.S. government.
The white man's purpose of the boarding schools were to kill the Indian and save the man. The indigenous race was seen as an inferior culture by white Americans. Thinking that it was their moral duty to save the man, boarding schools were established in order to introduce what was seen as a superior culture to the indigenous youth. Consequences of boarding school attendance were not only felt in cultural disconnect, but also language attrition, religious suppression, and the rupturing of familial ties. When children were sent to the schools, they carried with them their cultural clothing, hairstyles, and belongings. On return, they had been stripped of their traditional braids and wore comb-overs. They were stripped of their cultural garments and wore Americanized clothing. Another repercussion felt on return from boarding schools were the attempted eradication of Native American languages, which linked to the disconnect between the returning children and their families. Indigenous children were taught through violence to not participate in any aspect of their culture, complicating family dynamics upon return. The most detrimental effect of boarding schools were the eroding of Native American families. This policy was unfortunately successful in succeeding its goal of suppressing the Native American culture by assimilating its children.
The removal of indigenous children began in 1875, when boarding schools became the white quote-unquote solution to removing indigenous practices in order to better the nation. Children taken from their families and ripped from their lives in order to be submerged in a white man's view of an acceptable way of life. Boarding schools were established due to a lack of understanding for cultural practices that were not one's own, an idea defined as Eurocentrism. Indigenous culture was misunderstood, as it was not the tradition of white man's own. This ideology of white superiority, stemming from race ranking, led to indigenous people being blamed for what was quote-unquote known as the Indian problem. These boarding schools were an effort to erase cultural practices and tradition, attempting to assimilate and rid indigenous children of their way of life. Although the last boarding school was abolished as late as 1978, the lasting repercussions have haunted the children who were in these institutions. The lack of light shed on the fact that these indigenous children were stripped of their own identities in multiple ways and forbidden to speak their own language would later add to the hauntings that would stick with these children, most of who are adults today. Many children died at these schools after experiencing tremendous abuse, and for those who lived to tell the tale, their stories are not any better. While some survivors do not discuss their experiences, it is clear that they have tremendously affected their day-to-day lives. Many went on to have their own families, and these experiences did not just fade from their minds. Many of the practices instilled at these schools, such as how the children were taught, treated, or what was said to them, stick with them today and will forever navigate the course of their lives. These are the repercussions of what the white man did in order to erase indigenous culture. The massacre at Wounded Knee occurred in 1890, where the majority of deaths were indigenous women and children. This particular massacre occurred due to the violent white reaction to indigenous culture, as well as a lack of understanding for a different way of life that was not one's own. A specific example was the traditional indigenous practice of the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a dance performed by indigenous people as a form of individual expression that would later culminate into a form of historical resistance after many traditional dances were banned or forbidden. While this massacre in particular was due to specific indigenous practices,
Many other massacres of indigenous people were because of the Europeans' want for native land and resources, as well as what Europeans believed to be a cultural right over indigenous land. A prominent figure following many years after many indigenous massacres was Samuel Morton. Morton did not only collect skulls, but would add fuel to the fire of the belief that certain cultures were more intelligent and worthy than others. From Morton's collections, he developed that people could be divided into 5 races based upon skull sizes. While Morton's research lacked scientific evidence, his sizings determined the hierarchy of intelligence, where indigenous people sat second to last, with African Americans placed dead last. Although these findings followed many years after multiple indigenous communities were ruined, Morton would carry on the belief that intelligence could be determined by the idea of race. These ignorant beliefs would continue to add to the racism that indigenous people still face today.
Colonization and scientific racism have left indigenous peoples with continued oppression in many aspects of life. Blood quantum is a form of racial purity that tribal governments and the federal governments use to determine who can be a member based on how much indigenous blood is in their bodies, which is determined by who you descend from. Dogs, horses, and indigenous people are the only beings measured by blood quantum. Blood quantum is essentially a tool put in place by colonizers to scientifically make indigenous people extinct through time. There's a serious lack of funding for schools with a significant indigenous population. It is hard for these schools to get supplies, books, and even chairs needed to run a class. Because of this lack of funding, the students at these schools suffer with their education. The dropout rate for Native schools is 2 times the national average. Children that go to these underfunded schools continuously have low graduation rates and low higher education